Hi everyone, I'm Brian Hackett with Knox Soil and Water. I'm the wildlife specialist here, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to attract wildlife to your property. That being said, I'll share my screen here and we'll get started. So as I said, I'm Brian, wildlife specialist here with Knox Soil and Water. Um, Basically, my job entails a lot of what a lot of other soil and water districts do. I work partially with the technical side of building waterways and things like that. Um, Trying to manage soil erosion on farms and enhance water quality. But another portion of my job and what makes me the wildlife specialist is I do a lot of work with the Division of Wildlife, helping them out on different projects and things like that. And that's kind of what led me to talk to you today about attracting wildlife to your property. So go ahead and get started. So a lot of people, kind of wonder why, why there's this push, why tree hugging hippies and conservationists try to, make this push for people to incorporate habitat and host wildlife in your yard and on your property. There's parks, there's green, everywhere. I see trees and plants. So why should I need to do that at home? Is kind of what we hear a lot. And you know, a quick and dirty explanation can kind of be summed up into four main points there. A big one is population decline. So um, a lot of different wildlife species, ranging from insects all the way through birds, reptiles, amphibians, even some mammals. Um, are experiencing declines and very surprising and noticeable declines to a lot of scientists and ecologists and environmentalists. It's what some scientists are calling the sixth grade extinction. It's happening right now, and a lot of people believe it's anthropogenically caused. Caused by people and our impacts on the environment, and things like that. And so it kind of goes hand in hand with the rest of these. But I mean, basically, the root of wanting to install habitat is to try to help these other animals with their populations because they are being displaced so much. And that's kind of the third bullet point you see there, offsetting human growth. They're losing so much habitat and being displaced from their natural habitat. They're having to kind of move closer to people more so than what they would normally be comfortable, being in. And it's gotten to the point where a lot of our parks, our just our set aside land, our parks and things like that, isn't nearly enough habitat to actually be able to sustain these populations, in healthy numbers in a healthy, balanced ecosystem. And so that's a big part of this too is kind of offsetting that human expansion, urbanization, urban sprawl, that kind of stuff. Um, that most of the land that is east of the Mississippi River is held in private hands. It's privately owned by you and me, your average homeowner, and so it's up to us, really, to have that habitat available if we want to keep these species around, if we want to continue to have healthy, balanced ecosystems, because otherwise they're not going to be able to survive. And as a lot of um, if we lose some of these species, especially species like pollinators, big, key species, it can impact us as people severely, in terms of food production and things like that. So definitely two big reasons there. Another big reason is a lot of that green that you're seeing and that people are seeing out there is invasive. A lot of it's not native. A lot of it's alien species that are out competing our native species. And that's cause for alarm because these species aren't what our native wildlife has evolved and adapted to live with. And so the more and more we transform our landscape into kind of an oriental or an alien non-native landscape, basically, I mean, that green landscape could look like a desert to a black-capped chickadee in terms of being able to find food and raise its young. And the last part is just the fun factor, a lot of us, I know a lot of us watching here are excited about conservation and observing wildlife and things like that. But being able to bring that into your backyards and share some of those experiences with your kids or your neighbors, people that, aren't necessarily as inclined to be paying attention to that kind of stuff or really recognize it or want to be near it, if they can kind of have that more personal interaction, it can raise a lot of awareness and it can, cause people to want to do it themselves in their own yards or if you're teaching your kids this, it'll help them, kind of teach their friends and their kids down the line and influence their decisions when they become homeowners. So I will hit briefly on those points. I know a lot of us, here kind of understand the importance of creating habitat and why we create habitat, why you want to attract wildlife to your yard. But for those who haven't, or those who aren't as familiar, I'll kind of go through this pretty quick. But population declines. Birds. I mean, there was a very shocking report last year from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, talking about how we've lost nearly 3 billion birds overall. I mean, that's startling number for anybody. The graphics there on the left, you can kind of see 170 million eastern forest birds since 1970, a 17% decline in their population. Migratory birds, 2.5 billion migratory birds lost since 1970. That's 28% of that population of birds. And grassland species, one of the most impacted species because of our declining grassland habitats and remnant prairie habitats. 720 million grassland birds lost. That's a 53% decline in their population, which is very, very shocking, very startling. And the second bullet point there, the key group of organisms that birds need to raise their young are insects. Nearly all terrestrial birds raise their young on insect larvae, whether it's caterpillars or beetle larvae, grubs, whatever it is. Those soft, fleshy, protein-packed food sources are what they raise their babies off of. And so we're seeing those same declines in insects, and that's what's shocking is this group of organisms that we interpret as basically being all over the place. They're everywhere except maybe Antarctica. They're seeing tremendous declines in their population. Where it's the rusty patched bumblebee, which was the first bumblebee put on the endangered species list. The monarch butterfly, which is very famous. The honeybee, which is a non-native but still an important pollinator. A lot of these insects are facing population declines, which is really startling ecologists as well. Amphibians and reptiles kind of grouped together, but I mean, amphibians are almost considered the canary in the coal mine, if you will. Amphibians are very, as a group, they're very sensitive to changes in their environment, whether it's fluctuations in pH or temperature, things like that. They're very sensitive to those kind of things, and as early as the 1990s, global declines in amphibians across 70% of species have been documented, and I mean it's continued since the 90s. And so amphibians were kind of one of the first lights that scientists could see. You know, there's something wrong here. And reptiles were shortly after that. You know, about 10 years after that. You know, it was noted that you know, reptile species were in decline as well across the entire world. Turtles, lizards, snakes. I mean, you name it. Now, this isn't to say that every single species, you know, is in decline everywhere. There are certainly species that have been doing all right through this, and you know, are still very common today. It's more of looking at these groups of animals as a whole, and seeing those drops and those declines in population is what's really startling. Invasive species here on the right, you've kind of got a Neapolitan hodgepodge of invasive species there. Multiflora rose, loosestrife, bittersweet, honeysuckle, Callery pear. You know, these are all invasive plants that we know and hate. You know, what makes them invasive? They're non-native, but there's non-natives that are not considered invasive. These invasive guys are the ones that have escaped basically our gardens. They're ones that will readily, you know, take up in wild areas, in forests, along roadsides, ditches, things like that. They'll quickly volunteer, if you will, to grow just about anywhere. And being a non-native, they don't really have some of the pressures that our native species do. They typically grow quicker. They have a longer growing season, and they outcompete a lot of our native species. And so, what you see is in some areas a landscape that gets dominated by these foreign invasive species, and they are threatening, you know, our native plants in certain areas. And so there's a you know, big push across a lot of different groups and land management groups and things like that to eradicate or try to, you know, control these invasive species. And that's really what it takes, you know, is a large coordinated effort to kind of get a handle on them before they do become out of control, or else it can really cause a detriment to that local ecosystem. And that's really, you know, plants are at the foundation of the food web. So it all starts with plants. So having invasive plants on your landscape is definitely something, you know, a priority number one that you want to take care of and address, and be able to replace those with natives, which we'll get to here in a minute. Invasive animals, not as prevalent. The bigger stuff is not as prevalent as the plants or some of the insects. You know, for example, we have, you know, there's the feral pig issues, mainly affecting the southern region. There's the Burmese pythons down in Florida that are really causing an impact down there. So animals, it's kind of the same reason as plants. You know, why they're invasive. They kind of take up and they're not native. They don't have many or any natural predators to control their population, and the local wildlife and plants and things like that aren't used to having them here, and so they can cause tremendous impacts, either feeding on other animals or, in the case of the hogs, you know, tearing things up, tearing the ground up, tearing plants up. They can really cause a negative impact there. And obviously, you know, our invasive insects, such as the emerald ash borer, the Japanese beetle, spotter and lanternfly, these insects are definitely on people's radars now. You know, some say it's almost to a point where it's, you know, too late. We can't really do much. You know, they've already kind of come in and done their damage. So these are kind of some things that you want to keep an eye on in the invasives. So there's Ohio State has partnered with some people, you know, partnered with some other agencies. There's the Great Lakes Early Detection Network. iNaturalist is great. These are different kind of citizen science projects that can help detect these invasive species early on to try to help get ahead of them before they do get out of control. Urban sprawl, it's pretty self-explanatory, and spend a lot of time here, but you know, as I said before, most of that land east of the Mississippi is in privately owned hands, which is not a bad thing, but that means it's up to you and I, your average homeowners, to kind of help offset how much of that land has been paved and how much of it has been, built upon, because that's no longer a suitable habitat. So we need to kind of think about using some of our yard space to create some of that and bring some of that back. As I said before, the dedicated lands that we have set aside is just not enough acreage-wise to support healthy populations of a balanced ecosystem. So kind of switching gears now into more, that was kind of the why, and this is kind of the how. In light of Halloween coming up around the corner, I kind of made a play on that. But back from the dead. Basically, a lot of times ecologists call large turf grass areas like the one you see there in front of that house a dead landscape. And what does that mean? Yes, the grass is alive. Yes, those trees are alive. The bushes are alive. But that's really it. I mean, there's not a lot of those things are going to be ornamentals. Typically, a lot of times driving around, you'll see big, huge grass lawns with maybe some ornamental specimen trees and a few shrubs around the house. But a lot of those aren't native. The turf grass certainly isn't native. And you don't really see any animals. You don't see wildlife. You can find a few insects, maybe some ants, maybe some worms. The robins running around there trying to find some worms in the yard. But that's about it. You don't typically see a whole lot of wildlife in these kind of situations, in these kind of areas. Those cool season turf grasses don't offer any food or shelter. And while yes, lawns do have their place for people for recreational use and sometimes aesthetic use, how much is too much? We need to kind of look at scaling back and some of those yard spaces. What do we need, and then what are we willing to incorporate into some native gardening, native landscaping, things like that. So when wildlife is looking for places to live, to inhabit, it's looking for can it get what it needs to survive? Can it meet those basic needs of food, water, shelter, and space? And the other big one is reproduction. So are there enough available resources to raise your young? If you're an animal going into that situation, kind of put yourself in that position, in those shoes, so to speak, and kind of realize, what am I going to need here to just survive and raise a family here in this yard, in this backyard. And then finally, once you have kind of created a successful wildlife habitat, or you've brought some wildlife into your yard, spread the word. Share with others, tell people about why you did what you did, how you did it, successes, failures, things like that. And you can always put a sign up to kind of educate some people. I know there's typically in suburban neighborhoods and things like that, there's issues with HOAs, and certain people that don't like the look of necessarily a habitated, kind of space. But there are ways to kind of dress it up, make it look a little bit more kempt, using some rock fencing, some gravel paths, things like that, mulching. Those are all good, kind of ways you can dress it up a little bit, make it look a little bit more kempt. You can kind of mow borders, just mow kind of around the edges and keep that short. That way, at least it looks like somebody's caring for the place in some of those instances. So we're looking at transforming something like that into something like this. Something where you've got some structure there. You've got different sorts of flowering plants. You might have, some shrubs, some trees, rocks, things like that, to kind of provide and meet those basic needs for those different species of wildlife that you're trying to attract. So as I kind of hit on, reducing turf grass. This is a big one, and it's a hard hill to jump over, so to speak. Our conventional turf grass lawns are made up of a non-native cool season grass. These grasses do really well in the spring and the fall when we have that cooler, wetter weather, and don't do very well in the hot summer months. Um, these kind of grasses and this the style of having these big yards is an old aristocratic idea coming out of England. And prior to colonization of the Americas, it was common for the very, very wealthy to basically have these yards to accentuate their large mansions and display their wealth. So they're kind of like, hey, I can hire the landscapers and the guys to help maintain this and mow it and keep it neat and keep it tidy. So lawns were really a display of wealth in early England. And then those kind of ideas kind of translated, obviously, from when the English, settled America and came over here. Some of those ideas kind of persisted, but really it wasn't until the early to mid 1900s, and around World War II, even prior to World War II, many houses didn't really have yards. They didn't really have lawns like we know of today. And it kind of came up with when suburbs were kind of really starting to take off, and things like that. The suburbs were kind of designed with these houses, and you had your little plot of land in your yard, and and people kind of saw that as, okay, I've got my little piece of wealth here. And so that's kind of the story of the lawn and how it came to be so prevalent. But we kind of need to have a little bit of a change in a mindset about just how big and how much yard we actually need, and how much of it we can dedicate to rain gardens and things like that, and wildflowers, trees, shrubs. These things are going to create habitat for the wildlife you're trying to attract. Those turf grasses are not beneficial for the environment. They do, like I said, have a place. They do have a recreational value, playing, especially if you have children or pets. They have an aesthetic value to a lot of people, but they really are. They drain a lot of resources. They drain time. They drain gas to run gas-powered lawn equipment. They drain water resources if you're watering your lawn in the summer to try to keep it from dying. And the countless number of people that fertilize and put all kinds of stuff on their yard to try to keep it looking nice. So there's a lot of there's financial drains, there's water drains, time, your time you spent mowing and taking care of this large turf grass area. A lot of that's kind of unnecessary. And my challenge to you, basically, if you're looking to kind of create some of this habitat, is figure out how much of that turf grass you need, for your daily activities, for your recreational and your aesthetic values, and then turn the rest of that into habitat. Plant, find some native shrubs, find some wildflowers, rain gardens like you see over there are excellent habitat, pollinator habitat. And they look nice too. I mean, they're flowering, they're pretty. And so that's a great way to kind of get habitat into a small yard or a residential yard, somewhere in the suburbs, somewhere where you do have to might contend with an HOA or something like that. That's gonna want you to keep it look nice, but you can still kind of provide some of that habitat there, and not there's no such thing as too small. Any little bit helps. So kind of start talking about having a good foundation with the plants. You got to have good bones, just like in a house. You got to have a good foundation. Plants are the foundation of the food web, and they are the most important part about creating habitat and attracting wildlife to your property. Um, Incorporating native plants is key, because these are the kind of plants that our wildlife has adapted and evolved with. These are the kind of plants that they feed, they reproduce on, things like that. Many pollinator species, many insect species are what we call specialists. And that means they only will lay their eggs, and their larvae will only eat one type of plant. Monarchs are kind of a well-known species of this, with the milkweed, but there's many other species that have that same kind of characteristics with all different sorts of plants, whether it's black cherry or aster or wing stem, whatever it is. The various plants and grasses and sedges and things like that host specific insects. Um, and so when you have those native plants and you have those insects, you have food then for birds. And so then you attract birds to your property. They, as I said before, they love to feed their young those little protein packed larvae. And so where they can find that food, where they can find those insects to eat and to feed their young, that's where they're going to choose to build a nest or to take up residence in a birdhouse or something like that. And even after the flower has seeded, once a lot of those plants have seeded, birds like birds like finches will then go to that dried coneflower, and they'll eat the seeds out of there, and they'll go to the different seed heads and pick the seeds out of there. So a lot of those native wildflowers, once they've gone to seed, a lot of those seeds are consumed by the adult birds. So you can see how having plants there, having a good base, is very crucial to meeting all these other needs of wildlife. And when you're planting these kind of plants, you want to look for structure and diversity. So you want a diverse mix of species. You want some wildflowers, maybe some grasses, some sedges, and you want some shrubs, some mixed height stuff, and incorporate some trees into that too. That's kind of what goes into your structure, is having kind of different layers. And all those layers provide different things for birds, for insects, and for all other species of wildlife that you're trying to attract. Another big thing is ditching a lot of those chemicals. Pesticides. Typically, the pesticides that you can get at your local hardware store, convenience store, or whatever, they kill a lot more than what you're just going after, and you really got to be cautious. The best advice is to not use them at all. If you create a balanced enough ecosystem in your own yard, you're going to attract those carnivorous and those tertiary predator insects like assassin bugs and praying mantises, things like that, spiders, all kinds of spiders. And those species are going to help control a lot of those undesirable insects. So you can almost, if you plant your native species, if you build your habitat with structure and diversity, if you bring in and attract those herbivore insects, you're going to attract the carnivore insects, because then there's food for them to eat. And they're going to kind of help, control a lot of your pests. And the same thing goes for bringing in different kinds of reptiles, snakes. A lot of our native snakes stay really small, and a lot of them like to feed on slugs and earthworms and soft-bodied insects and things like that. And your toads, your frogs, your salamanders, a lot of your amphibians are going to eat those insects too. So you create that habitat, and you start bringing in each level of the food chain, and you'll eventually you'll have your own pest management program, if you will. Using herbicides sparingly, I include that because a lot of the main best way to get rid of a lot of our invasive species is with an herbicide. And so for trying to control weedy, invasive species, things like that, yes, herbicide can be used. Just do it sparingly, do it cautiously, read the labels, things like that. Be aware of what's around it, and be aware that you're not, you're spraying on a windy day and your herbicide drifts over to that milkweed plant over there and kills the whole plant, that was going to feed that monarch caterpillar or something like that. The final thing there is just to learn to appreciate the flaws and blemishes. A lot of people get perturbed by the fact that they see, leaf damage from a caterpillar or something like that on a tree. The thing is our native plant species have evolved and adapted to live with these other organisms within the ecosystem, and so if it's a native species, if it's a native insect or whatever, those trees and those plants can handle that damage. I mean, that's what they've evolved to and adapted to be able to withstand. I mean, it's not going to kill them. And so people just kind of need to be a little bit more accepting of that. Not reaching for that pesticide if you see, some caterpillars on your oak tree, because, most of the time those are going to be very beneficial insects. The next item there is just like I have been hitting on, meeting basic needs. That's going to be the biggest driver for attracting these species to your yard. Creating that habitat, as you see there with that yard there, you incorporate that habitat in with your grass, turf grass. You can still have that turf grass there to use and recreate on, and things like that, and kept looking nice. But then have a lot of that habitat surrounding it, and you have that structure and those layers and those height differentials. Have wildflowers that bloom all season long. So you'll have your early blooming wildflowers, your mid blooming wildflowers, your late blooming wildflowers. And if you cover that whole bloom time, you're feeding those pollinators and those insects all year long. And that's only going to keep them around in your yard. And as I said, the birds feed their young and raise their young on these soft-bodied insects and things like that. As you see there, Doug Tallamy's research, an adult breeding pair of chickadees has to catch 7,500 caterpillars to rear one clutch of young. That's 7,500 caterpillars they've got to find. And if you have a lot of species, non-native species that aren't really, that those specialist pollinators and things like that can't lay their eggs on, those insects, those caterpillars are not going to be there. So that kind of hits on food and water, shelter and space. As you see down on the bottom there, leaving stick piles, leaving wood piles and things like that will actually provide a lot of habitat for moths, for hibernating bees and other pollinating insects. You might have some small mammals or some reptiles or amphibians hibernate in that. Just having those kind of little brush piles kind of around or tucked away, if you consider them unsightly, just have them kind of towards the back end of your property, and those can provide a lot of shelter and space for a lot of things over the winter to hibernate in. And then you've got bird houses, bat boxes. Obviously, those are pretty well known shelter and space resources for some species of wildlife there. as I said before, and I've hit on a few times, the reproduction, um, those specialist species of insects need those native plants. And without them, they can't rear their young there. Therefore, you're not going to have the birds. Therefore, you're not going to get some of those predator insects. You're not going to get the amphibians, the reptiles that are going to hunt there, and so on and so forth. It just kind of keeps going up the food chain. So we want to be, basically with all this, we want to be ecocentric and not egocentric. We want, you know, we want to be able to have our yard be a part of the environment, not something separate where we are here and the environment and nature is out there. Um, in order to truly attract wildlife and make it a wildlife haven, you've got to be able to part with some societal norms and some things that people, a lot of people still don't think look good or don't meet their definition of landscaping or yards or things like that. And a lot of that, I kind of ask myself is, does it not look good, or do we just need to redefine what looks good, what looks like good landscaping in our minds? Do we just need to kind of take a step back and readjust? So in the spirit of fall there, it's almost that time of year. I put that message from the Xerces Society, leaving the leaves. A lot of pollinators, queen bumblebees will hibernate in leaf litter. A lot of pollinators will lay their pupa, their larvae, will be under that leaf litter. Just having those leaves on the ground is actually a really important source of insulation and hibernation material for some of those pollinators and insects. And finally, just inform and educate. Tell your friends and neighbors why you've created what you've created. Teach your kids the importance of existing with nature. Take them out in that yard and that space and show them the cocoons and the chrysalises of the insects, and show them the wren that's looking and hunting for insects to feed its babies, and so on and so forth. Volunteer your yard for workshops and tours. That can be a great way to kind of inform and educate people about what you've done and kind of show off your hard work as well. And you can also get your yard certified by the National Wildlife Federation, have it be certified wildlife habitat. And that's sometimes a good way, especially if you're in an area where a lot of people don't see eye to eye with you on the wildlife habitat. It can kind of teach them and educate them and open their eyes a little bit to what you're doing and why you're doing it. With that being said, that's all I have. Thank you for paying attention and following along, and I'll see you guys later.